Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we're back for another takeoff and landing tutorial. This time we're in the FlyingIron Simulations Supermarine Spitfire Mark 9. My last tutorial video in the Corsair seemed to be reasonably well received, and I had a few people reach out to me asking if I could do the same thing with the Spitfire. So I thought we'd do exactly that. Again, whilst I would consider myself to be reasonably proficient in the aircraft, the advice that I'll be giving you in today's video is obviously not expert advice, and the procedures that we use may differ from that of the real world aircraft. For today's flight then, we're currently on the ground at Goodwood Aerodrome in the FlyingIron Simulations Supermarine Spitfire Mark 9. As with the previous video, we're going to carry out a takeoff, a quick lap around the airfield and come back for the landing. We'll brief each of the procedures before we carry them out, and then we'll discuss them as we go. It's worth stating now though that unlike the Corsair, which had a fairly prescribed set of procedures to get the aircraft airborne and back on the ground, the Spitfire is a very different beast, and particularly the FlyingIron Simulations version of it requires a lot of finesse and constant diligence and management of the controls. Again though, we'll discuss more of this as we go. As always guys, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. We'll now head for the cockpit of the Mark 9, we'll briefly discuss the takeoff and then we'll get the aircraft up in the air. So welcome back once again to the cockpit of the FlyingIron Simulations Supermarine Spitfire Mark 9. As I mentioned, we're currently here on the ground, runway 32 here at Goodwood Aerodrome, and in today's video we're going to carry out a quick lap around the airfield, carrying out the takeoff and the landing in the Spitfire, and I'll give you my tips and advice for flying the aircraft as we go. The Spitfire, as I mentioned in my previous takeoff and landing tutorial with the Corsair, is certainly a very different beast from the Corsair. It requires a lot more finesse and careful handling during the takeoff and the landing. First thing to note, it's quite important to have the correct configuration for the takeoff in the Spitfire. So we'll set the rudder fully right on the trim, or fully starboard. In terms of the elevator trim, the manual does call for a little bit of nose down trim during the takeoff, but I find that the neutral position is more than adequate. And we'll leave the flaps up for the takeoff in the Spitfire as well, which might seem a little bit counterintuitive, but that is the real world procedure. In terms of the takeoff itself, one of the really important things to note is that the Spitfire generally doesn't require full power for the takeoff. The more power that you use, the more of a swing you're going to see from the nose, which of course is going to make controlling the aircraft much more difficult. Generally I aim for around 8 pounds a boost during the takeoff run, and I find that the takeoff is very manageable in terms of our rudder input with that power setting. So as I mentioned, we will see a swing from the nose with the amount of torque that the engine produces amongst other effects, and so we're going to need to counteract that with some right rudder during the takeoff run. Unlike the Corsair, we won't need to feed in that rudder before we've begun the run, we'll just slowly and gently feed in some rudder input as the speed increases and the tendency for the nose to swing out to the left increases as well. We use a tiny bit of back pressure on the stick just to keep the nose up. And lastly, about midway through the takeoff run, you'll notice there's a tendency for the right wing to lift up. We're going to have to counteract that with some right aileron, and I find that we'll need almost full right aileron to counter the wing lift, which I'm not sure is realistic, but that is what's needed to keep the aircraft under control. Again, unlike the Corsair, which needs a little bit of brute force and ignorance, the Spitfire really requires some finesse. You will have to correct any deviations from your desired flight path very quickly, but also very smoothly, and try not to get too excited on the controls. Try and keep your inputs as small as possible. So we're all set and ready to go. Park brake can come off. A little bit of aft pressure on the stick as I mentioned, just to keep the nose up during the takeoff. Very gradually coming up on the power to around 8 psi boost. Rudder and ailerons will keep neutral for now, but as soon as we start to notice the nose swing out to the left, we'll feed in the right rudder and quite a lot of right aileron as well. So feeding in the rudder and the aileron now. Trying our best to keep the aircraft straight on the centre line. There's 8 psi boost, and just flying the aircraft off the runway. Tap the brakes, gear can come up, and almost immediately we'll come back to 4 psi on the boost. As soon as we do that, we can start trimming the aircraft out again using some left rudder trim. Through 500 feet, so we'll start a turn out to the left for the circuits. course everything happens rather quickly in the Spitfire in the circuits. There's 1,000 feet, so levelling off. And we'll come back to 0 on the boost. Around 2600 RPM. And just keep the turn coming around to make sure that the circuit doesn't end up being too wide. Keep easing off on that rudder trim as well now that we've reduced the power. And that is the most important thing to account for with the landing. We'll reset the rudder trim back to neutral. Brakes are checked, undercarriage will hold, mixture is rich, fuel pump is on, harness is secure. Just passing a beam of the threshold now, so we'll start coming back on the power. Let the speed bleed back a little bit before we take the gear. We'll start our turn onto base. And the 3 really important things for the landing in the Spitfire are we need to make sure we have the rudder trim reset to 0. Make sure we have little to no drift on when we touch down. It's going to be almost impossible to correct for any drift once we touch down on the runway. And similarly, if we do get any drift on, try not to correct it with any abrupt control inputs. Speed just coming below 160 knots, so we'll take the flaps. Let that speed keep bleeding off. And we'll trim for around 90 miles an hour. The aircraft is going to want to deviate off course on the landing. It's very unstable on the landing, so really resist the urge to make any abrupt control inputs. That's really the key to success with the landing of the Spitfire. If you absolutely have to make any inputs, make sure that they're very small and concise, but avoid making inputs altogether if you can. So we're doing 90 miles an hour now. Pitch is full fine, undercarriage is down, flaps are set, landing clearance is not required, runway is clear. And we'll just zigzag slightly on the approach to keep the threshold in sight. And again, making sure that we are straight on the runway just before we touch down. You'll find as well you need quite a lot of aft elevator trim with the speed around 90 miles an hour. So just coming around onto final now, getting ourselves lined up with the runway. Coming back off the power. We want to hold the aircraft off the ground, but not with too high nose up attitude. We don't want to touch down tail wheel first. And there's touchdown. Again, resisting the urge to make any major control inputs. Full back stick and the flaps up as soon as we touch down. Should have got the flaps up a touch earlier there. And just very gentle on the brakes, bring the aircraft to a stop. So there you go guys, I hope you enjoyed our quick lap around Goodwood Aerodrome in the FlyingIron Simulations Supermarine Spitfire Mark 9, and I hope you found the video to be of use as well. Unfortunately, as I say, unlike the Corsair, there's really only so much advice I can give you to help with the takeoff and landing in the Spitfire. Ultimately, it is a very tricky aircraft to control in both of these phases. Arguably, it's the most difficult aircraft in the sim currently when it comes to takeoff and landing. And so while some of these techniques that we've mentioned today will hopefully be of some use, ultimately you are just going to need to work on your stick and rudder skills to get the aircraft up in the air in a controlled fashion. Anyway, we'll briefly recap on the main pointers that we touched on throughout the tutorial. For the takeoff in the Spitfire, the main things to note there is we need full starboard or full right trim on the rudder. Where possible, we need to avoid using max boost for the takeoff. This will help to minimise the swing during the takeoff run, and should make the aircraft much easier for you to control. In terms of rudder control during the takeoff, the Spitfire is fairly straightforward. We just need to feed in the rudder to counteract the swing. The aircraft does have a tendency to pick up a wing whenever we put in any rudder inputs, and so as we discussed, you need to be ready to counteract those with the ailerons. Generally speaking, whenever you make a significant rudder input, you need to be prepared to put in a similar aileron input, and I find that generally on a normal takeoff, about half right to about 2/3 right aileron will keep the wings level. In terms of the landing, we need to make sure that the rudder trim is set back to neutral. As we discussed, if you want, you can fly a curved approach or zigzag your way down final to keep the runway centerline in sight. Hopefully you'll find that a useful technique, and it will help you to get the aircraft straight before touchdown. As we mentioned, it's very important to have the aircraft straight before you touch down. It's almost impossible to correct any drift in the Spitfire currently. If you do touch down with some crab or some drift on and try and correct it with rudder, you'll find that you'll almost certainly induce a wing scrape, and the aircraft will become uncontrollable very quickly thereafter. Similarly, once we've touched down, you want to minimise your control inputs as much as possible, doing the absolute bare minimum to keep the aircraft on the runway centerline. Once we touch down, it's full back stick and the flaps up, just to get the aircraft firmly planted on the runway and the tail wheel on the ground. And then I find it's best to avoid using the rudder, as that's just going to induce, again, a wing drop. Instead, I prefer to use a tiny amount of left or right braking to keep the aircraft on the centerline. One last thing that I thought was worthy of mention, it probably applies to the Corsair as well, but it's certainly relevant for the Spitfire. I'm sure that many of you are wondering why the aircraft is so difficult to land in a crosswind. And as we've discussed, it's important to get the aircraft straightened up before touching down, which of course in a crosswind can be pretty tricky to do. I think it's important to appreciate that the Spitfire in reality probably didn't have to deal all that much with significant crosswind conditions. As you can see from Goodwood Aerodrome here, a fairly typical layout for World War II RAF bases was to have 3 runways arranged in a triangular formation. Aircraft performance during the era was often such that they needed every knot of headwind that they could get during the takeoff run. And so really during the World War II period it was pretty uncommon to land in a crosswind, as you pretty much always had a runway option available taking off into wind. Similarly, a lot of historical airfields were just that, fields, and so again the aircraft could always choose which direction it wanted to take off in. So as I say, the Spitfire probably wasn't designed for significant crosswind conditions. Obviously a lot of modern airports and aerodromes don't cater for this, so you might have to find that you plan your trips accordingly. Once again guys, I do hope that you enjoyed the video and found it to be of use. If you did, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. Sharing the video as well is a massive help. If you have any comments or questions for me, please leave those down in the comments section below and I'll do my best to answer them. But for now, thanks very much and I'll see you all again soon.